Welcome to Silent Screams, where darkness, whispers, and terror await you. Are you ready to confront your fears? Story 1: The Curse of Margot's Dollhouse. When I moved to the small town of Millfield, the locals warned me about the old antique shop on Ashbury Lane. They said it was cursed, that people who took anything from there often regretted it. I brushed off their warnings. Superstitions didn't faze me. I had just inherited my late grandmother's house and was eager to furnish it with antiques that fit its vintage aesthetic. The shop was as eerie as described, dimly lit. Walls lined with dusty shelves, and the faint smell of decaying wood lingering in the air. The shopkeeper, a gaunt woman with sunken eyes, greeted me with a strange smile. "Looking for anything particular?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "Something unique for my living room," I replied, scanning the shelves. That's when I saw it, a dollhouse. No taller than 2 feet, with intricate details carved into its wooden frame. It was exquisite, almost lifelike. I was drawn to it, though I couldn't explain why. "How much for this?" I asked. The shopkeeper's expression darkened. "It's not for sale," she muttered, but her eyes flicked nervously to the dollhouse. I pressed on, offering her double the price of anything else in the shop. She hesitated before agreeing, but as she handed it over, she whispered, "Be careful. It belonged to Margot." The dollhouse sat in my living room, perched on a side table. The details were mesmerizing. Tiny curtains hung on the windows. Miniature furniture was arranged perfectly in each room, and the front door even had a brass doorknob no bigger than a pinhead. That night, I was awoken by a faint tapping sound. I dismissed it as branches against the window, but when I went downstairs in the morning, the dollhouse door was open. I distinctly remembered closing it before bed. Brushing off the incident, I went about my day. But the tapping returned the next night. Louder this time. It was rhythmic, deliberate. I crept downstairs with a flashlight, heart pounding. The dollhouse door was wide open again, and one of the tiny chairs had been moved to the center of the living room inside the dollhouse. My stomach tightened. I hadn't touched the dollhouse since placing it there. Over the next few days, the occurrences became stranger. I started hearing faint whispers when I walked past the dollhouse. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the whispers grew louder at night, and I began catching fragmented words. "Stay with us." I told myself I was imagining things, but doubt crept in. One evening, I decided to investigate. I examined the dollhouse closely, running my fingers over its carved details. That's when I noticed something chilling. A tiny figure had appeared in one of the rooms. It was a doll I hadn't seen before. A woman with pale skin and an old-fashioned dress, standing by the miniature fireplace. The next morning, the doll was gone. Desperate for answers, I returned to the antique shop. The shopkeeper's face paled when she saw me. "You didn't open it, did you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Open what?" "The dollhouse," she whispered. "Margot's spirit is tied to it. She lived alone in a big house, just like that one. And she collected dolls, hundreds of them. When she passed, the house was sold off, but the dollhouse remained. They say her soul lives inside it, and she collects people." I laughed nervously, but the shopkeeper's gaze was deadly serious. "You need to get rid of it," she said. "Burn it." I couldn't bring myself to destroy something so beautiful, so I decided to research Margot's history instead. What I found chilled me to the core. Margot had been accused of witchcraft in the 1800s. The townspeople claimed she lured children to her home, turning them into dolls to keep her company. They found dozens of lifelike dolls in her attic after she died. But none of the missing children were ever recovered. That night, I decided to stay awake, determined to catch whatever, or whoever, was behind the strange occurrences. As the clock struck midnight, the whispers began again, louder and clearer than ever before. "Join us." The dollhouse started shaking violently. Its tiny lights flickered, and the whispers turned into a cacophony of voices, each one begging, pleading, and screaming. Then, I saw them. Tiny figures emerged from the dollhouse, dolls with hollow eyes and twisted expressions, clawing their way out. I screamed and backed away. But the dolls grew larger as they crawled toward me, their porcelain faces cracking to reveal something darker underneath. The last thing I saw before blacking out was Margot's doll standing at the front of the group, her cold, lifeless eyes fixed on mine. When I woke up, the dollhouse was gone. My living room was untouched, as if it had never been there. I tried to convince myself it was all a bad dream. But a week later, I saw a news article about a dollhouse appearing in another town's antique shop. The photo accompanying the article made my blood run cold. It was the same dollhouse, and inside one of its tiny rooms was a new doll, a figure that looked exactly like me. Story 2, The Whisper of Abigail. It started innocently enough, as these stories often do. Claire Bennett, a collector of vintage artifacts, stumbled upon an estate sale in a quiet, fog-drenched town on the outskirts of Maine. Among the dusty furniture and faded paintings, a peculiar doll caught her eye. It was old, with porcelain skin that had cracks like veins, and glassy blue eyes that seemed to follow her every movement. The auctioneer explained its history with a sly smile. Legend says she belonged to a girl named Abigail in the 1800s. She never went anywhere without it. When Abigail died, well, people started whispering about strange things happening around this doll. Claire wasn't one for ghost stories, but there was something captivating about the doll. She placed her bid and took it home, never suspecting that her life was about to unravel. The doll sat in a corner of Claire's antique-filled living room, silent and still. Yet, it commanded attention. Visitors commented on its unsettling gaze, but Claire laughed it off. That night, Claire woke to the sound of faint giggles. She brushed it off as a dream until she noticed the doll was no longer on its pedestal. It was on the floor, face turned toward the bedroom door. "Must have fallen," Claire murmured, though the placement seemed deliberate. The incidents began to pile up. Doors opened and closed on their own. The faint scent of lavender, a fragrance Claire didn't own, wafted through the air. And the giggles grew louder, no longer confined to the edges of her sleep. Driven by unease, Claire researched the doll's origins. Abigail, it seemed, was a tragic figure. She had died mysteriously at 8 years old, her parents both claiming innocence but each accusing the other of murder. The doll was buried with her but unearthed decades later during renovations on the family estate. Claire's dreams became vivid. In them, Abigail appeared as a pale child with tangled curls, always holding the doll. She whispered secrets, her voice sweet but chilling. She lied, Abigail said one night. They both did. She killed me. And now, you'll help me. Claire woke gasping, the doll sitting on her chest, Its cracked porcelain hand rested on her throat. Claire tried to rid herself of the doll, taking it to a local church. The priest hesitated before agreeing to bless it. As he muttered prayers, the doll's head turned toward him with a loud crack. The lights in the church flickered, and the smell of burnt lavender filled the room. "She doesn't want to leave," the priest whispered, his voice trembling. By the time Claire returned home, the doll was already there, perched on the living room couch. The whispers grew more insistent, filling her head even in daylight. Abigail's presence was no longer confined to the doll. Shadows moved in her peripheral vision, and her reflection in mirrors often lingered, watching with those glassy blue eyes. Desperate, Claire contacted a local occultist, Madame Leclerc, known for her dealings with malevolent spirits. The woman examined the doll with a grim expression. "This isn't just a haunting. The child's soul is bound to it. But there's more, something else is feeding on her anger, twisting her spirit into something vengeful." Madame Leclerc prepared a ritual to sever Abigail's connection to the doll. Candles flickered as ancient chants filled the air. The doll began to move, its limbs jerking like a marionette. "You can't take me away," Abigail's voice screamed from the shadows, high-pitched and filled with fury. Claire watched in horror as the doll lunged at Madame Leclerc, its porcelain hand breaking off and embedding itself in the woman's throat. Blood splattered across the room as Madame Leclerc fell, choking on her final breath. The candles extinguished, plunging the room into darkness. The next morning, Claire found herself holding the doll with no memory of how it got there. Her reflection in the mirror was wrong, her eyes weren't hers anymore. They were Abigail's. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a sinister clarity in Claire's mind. Abigail wasn't haunting her anymore. She was inside her, driven by a force she couldn't control. Claire packed her car with the doll and drove to the estate where Abigail had lived. The mansion was abandoned, its windows dark and yawning. Inside the mansion, Claire felt Abigail's presence growing stronger, guiding her steps. She reached the attic, where a rotting trunk sat in the corner. Inside, she found a child's skeleton wrapped in a faded blanket. As she placed the doll beside the bones, the air grew icy, and Abigail's voice rang out, clear and triumphant. "Now they'll know." The walls began to bleed, the whispers turning into anguished screams. Abigail's story wasn't over. She wanted revenge, not just on her parents but on anyone who ignored her cries. Weeks later, the doll appeared at another estate sale, pristine and inviting. A young woman with a fascination for the macabre bought it, enchanted by its eerie beauty. And so, Abigail's story continued, her whispers weaving their way into the lives of new victims, one soul at a time. Story 3: The Silent Companions. Emily Carter was a collector of peculiar antiques. The thrill of finding hidden treasures at estate sales and auctions gave her an adrenaline rush she couldn't get anywhere else. One cold autumn evening, she stumbled upon a dusty auction house on the outskirts of town. The event promised rare curiosities and one-of-a-kind finds, and Emily couldn't resist. Among the mundane lots of old furniture and tarnished silverware, a peculiar item caught her eye: a set of 3 antique dolls nestled in a cracked wooden box. Their glassy eyes seemed to glisten under the dim light, and their delicate porcelain faces bore a haunting beauty. The auctioneer described them as Victorian-era relics with a mysterious provenance. But what sealed the deal for Emily was the price, an unbelievably low starting bid. She won them for $20. As she carried the box to her car, an elderly man approached her, His face was etched with deep lines of concern. "Don't take them home," he muttered. "They're not what they seem." Emily brushed him off. People were always superstitious about old dolls. She placed the box in her trunk and drove home, unaware that she'd just invited something sinister into her life. Emily placed the dolls on a shelf in her study, admiring their craftsmanship. Each doll was unique. The first wore a crimson dress with lace trim, her dark curls spilling down her porcelain shoulders. The second was dressed in pale blue, with delicate blonde hair tied back with a satin ribbon. The third was the smallest, with raven black hair and a stark white dress, her eyes seeming to pierce the dim room. That night, Emily heard faint giggles echoing through the house. At first, she thought it was her imagination. She lived alone, after all. But as the sounds grew louder and more distinct, she began to feel uneasy. She checked every room, only to find silence. When she returned to her study, the dolls were no longer in their original positions. The crimson-dressed doll now sat at the edge of the shelf, staring directly at her. Emily laughed nervously. "Maybe I bumped the shelf," she thought, though the unease lingered. Over the next few days, strange occurrences became routine. Doors creaked open on their own. Cold spots appeared in rooms, and Emily frequently misplaced objects, only to find them in peculiar places, like her car keys stuffed into her pillowcase. The worst was the whispering. It always started after midnight, faint voices that seemed to drift from her study. One night, determined to prove it was nothing, Emily stayed up late with a flashlight. At exactly 3 a.m., the whispering began. She crept to the study, her hands trembling. As she opened the door, the flashlight beam landed on the dolls. They had moved again. The crimson doll was now standing upright, her tiny porcelain hand pointing toward the corner of the room. The blue doll sat cross-legged on the desk, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. The smallest doll was missing. A chilling giggle broke the silence, coming from behind her. Desperate for answers, Emily researched the dolls' origins. She discovered that they were part of an infamous collection known as the Silent Companions. Legend claimed that the dolls had belonged to a Victorian family whose daughters had all died tragically young. The grieving parents had commissioned the dolls to resemble their lost children, but the family had perished in a mysterious fire shortly after the dolls were completed. Over the years, the dolls had passed through various owners, each reporting eerie phenomena. Emily reached out to a local historian, Dr. Evelyn Marks, who reluctantly agreed to visit. Dr. Marks examined the dolls and confirmed Emily's fears. "These aren't just antiques," she said gravely. "They're vessels. Something is bound to them, something malevolent." Dr. Marks suggested destroying them, but Emily hesitated. She felt an inexplicable connection to the dolls, as though they were watching her every move, pleading to stay. That night, Emily dreamt of 3 little girls. They stood in a charred nursery, their faces pale and sad. "Stay with us," they whispered. "We're so lonely." Emily's breaking point came when her best friend, Sarah, visited and ended up in the hospital after tripping on the stairs. "I swear I felt something push me," Sarah said weakly. Emily decided it was time to end the nightmare. With Dr. Mark's guidance, she prepared a ritual to sever the connection. The process involved salt circles, holy water, and burning the dolls in a consecrated fire. As Emily began the ritual, the house trembled. The dolls' glass eyes seemed to glimmer with rage. and the whispering escalated into a deafening roar. The smallest doll suddenly launched itself across the room, striking Emily's chest. "Stop!" a childlike voice shrieked. Ignoring her fear, Emily doused the dolls in holy water and set them aflame. The flames burned an unnatural shade of green, and the whispering turned into agonized screams. Finally, the fire died out, leaving nothing but ashes. Emily moved out of her house, unable to bear the lingering memories. Months later, she visited a local thrift store and froze in her tracks. On a dusty shelf sat 3 dolls, eerily familiar: a crimson dress, a pale blue ribbon, and a stark white gown. Their glassy eyes seemed to follow her as she backed away, heart pounding. And then she heard it, the faintest whisper: "You can't get rid of us that easily."